All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, panelists, audience members, and to our collaborators from the Center for Expanded Poetics. Happy you could join us. Welcome to the second of 3 expanded dialogues, today reflecting on fractured communication, fragmented society. I'll let the organizers contextualize. Welcome to our virtual channel. For those of you unfamiliar with Concordia's fourth space, we are physically located on unceded Indigenous land in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we operate as a university-wide platform to activate the research, teaching, and various initiatives happening across the university so as to connect the public with the inner workings of a university in terms of the various ideas, projects, and cross-disciplinary ventures brewing inside of labs, studios, or classrooms. All of our events are free and open to all, and I invite you to check out what's coming up. I'll put those links in the chat in a minute. I'll just also note that we are recording and live streaming this event. All communication channels have been activated in this Zoom space, chat, Q&A, and virtual hand raising so that you might speak or all on. But of course, you can also join the conversation today. And I'll, again, let the organizers tell you more about the proceedings as I pass things over now to you, Fintan and Marlena. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to Fourth Space for collaborating with us on this adventure, and also to the CEP for hosting us. My name is Marlene Oeffinger. I am a PhD student in the Department of English at Concordia University, and I have collaborated with Fintan Neelan on this particular project of Expanded Poetics to bring together the community of Concordia in this virtual space. And I hand over to Fintan to explain a little more.
Thanks, Marlena. Okay, so as Marlena introduced me there, my name is Fintan Neelan. I'm a research intern at the Center for Expanded Poetics. And also welcome more generally to the second part of our Expanded Dialogues Symposium series, where we seek to explore issues of uncertainty and selfhood through a kind of conversational form. Our dialogue today will address these concerns under the title, as Anna put it earlier, of Fractured Communication, Fragmented Society. Just a quick thing for anyone who wasn't at our first event, the Expanded Dialogues project that myself and Marlena have been pursuing, it came about as a response to a simple fact, that we're living in a time when we no longer have the spontaneity and productive uncertainty of university life that comes with being physically present in a site or a space. Foreclosed is the possibility of running into people or of making chance acquaintances or new discoveries of shared interests or surprising links in research. And especially on that last point, in some ways, this is for academics, we're in a university online setting now. These are moments often that are the seeds that blossom into lots of different research collaborations. And even though the end seems to be in sight, there is a sense, regarding the pandemic, there is a sense that university life has been changed irrevocably by the last year, and that many of the online aspects will more than likely remain even after the pandemic. So given the inevitability of video conferencing software in the academic world, Expanded Dialogues seeks to recreate kind of a space online for these accidental encounters and for interrogating concepts through an unpredictable and unanticipatable association of ideas. So today we're looking at questions of communications in society, the pressures and tensions in both in a negative and a positive way, hopefully, that might be imminent in both. Just a quick point on the format for anyone who's unfamiliar. We're going to have two initial conversants, Ana Gorman and Carlos Velasquez. And that section of the event is going to start us off to warm up the conversation. That will run for about 15 minutes. And at the starting from the 15-minute point, we're going to sequentially add new participants, two other participants in this case. First, we'll add Matthew Raymond into the conversation. And then after another 10 minutes, we'll add in Hannah Grover. You'll see a little timer show up when that's near time. And about at the 40 or 45-minute mark, we will open it up to the audience. So everyone will be upgraded to a participant role. So everyone can either turn on their video and their microphone and can join in if you so wish. Also, if you are joining in, just give us a brief, tell us who you are. You know, it's very much, we want to expand the conversation out to all participants where possible. But with that all out of the way in the format, I'm going to hand it over to our first two conversants to kick things off. So our first two, as I said before, are Anna and Carlos. If you want to take it away, happy talking.
Hi, so my name's Anna. I'm a Concordia student. I'm in the MA program for philosophy. I'm in my second year, and my work is primarily centered around phenomenology and also how that may intersect with surrealism. I'm also an artist, and a lot of my art centers on how we represent ourselves, and primarily how we transpose the ideas of ourselves into a digital space, and how we recreate a kind of self-identity online.
Well, I'll just jump in ahead. I'm Carlos Velasquez. I'm a PhD candidate at the sociology department here at Concordia, and I know what we had talked about your work yesterday, and then I was thinking of considering the topic of the discussion or the conversation. And this idea of let's say the inability to connect with other people or let's say other people, or people who are coming from other historical backgrounds or other backgrounds in general. I was thinking of your work, and I wanted to ask you, to what degree do you think that the inability or the difficulty to represent ourselves is in itself becomes a problem of communication, and where we can't, it's difficult to establish any link when we're still trying to figure out how to represent ourselves in this space or new space that could be the cyberspace.
Yeah. I think I'm primarily interested in like the difference of translation that can take place in that space, from yourself to the version that you're presenting online. Or this even works in like an intersubjective way of like the way that you present yourself when you walk into a room with a bunch of people that you don't know. You can kind of choose how you are perceived, or at least what takes place is a kind of like othering of yourself. And usually that's not really successful in the way that we don't really know exactly how we come off to other people, and we're trying to present it in a certain way, but you're never really going to see how someone else actually perceives you or their thoughts of you. You can only suspect. So that's something that I'm really interested in terms of my work. And it's all about the communication, right? And the differences between the way that I perceive something and the way that you perceive something. And that's also, to me, this like is really the core of phenomenology. And it's like this intersubjective corroboration of our idea of reality. It's like, how do you know that the thing that you're looking at appears the same way to me, right? We come to this conclusion through communication and through the idea of like, okay, you see this, I see this too, or you see this way. It can kind of like shape your perspective, and also changes the way that you understand the world and the way that you navigate reality.
I like the point that you bring up, but it also generates a question for me, or a bit of a doubt, in the sense that I with these, or an idea that I have, or let's say a critique that I generally have with these positions, has to do with the risk of absolute contingency. You know, like if we that constant, let's say, reconfiguration through that constant discussion probably can lead us to a point where everything becomes so contingent of the participants of the exclusive interaction, let's say, where any attempt to connect beyond the particular, or that instance or the moment of that particular connection becomes impossible, because, you know, like if we're only considering the connection as the point of convergence, I think we lose. And I'll be honest, like this is more or less my general critique in these terms, because in these, let's say in the research that I conduct the research that I conduct is grounded on, and it's something I thought about sharing with everyone, but I'll propose the quote, and it's Frederick James in his critique of postmodern culture or late capitalism always proposes that, or says that we should always historicize. That's his claim. And the idea
always what?
Always historicize, right? Always consider the context under historical terms, understanding that there is always a historical ground, which is material in many ways, that determines the type of interactions that we have, and thus, let's say that risk of absolute contingency is lost for the relations that we participate in are historically determined, right? There are historical circumstances that determine the type of relations that we might have. And this is, yes, a very Marxist view of that.
No, it's really interesting that you brought this up, because I think the image that I was thinking of, that I was trying to prepare for this conversation, it was making me think of history and the way that narratives are told through history and the way that they're changed. So I'll just share my screen so I can show you guys the image that I was seeing, that I put together. So can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So these are screenshots that I took from a YouTube video of some guy demonstrating generation loss. And so what he's doing is it all takes place on VHS. So in the first cube, or in the first square, it's just the primary recording, and then he like records that recording on another VHS and then keeps replaying it. And then eventually, after he does it a few times, it's like totally lost the meaning. So it's kind of like this game of telephone, you know, like you have a first message and you're giving it to another person, and as it goes on, it gets totally distorted. And this is making me think of the way that historical narratives are told, and like the contingency that you were just talking about, as it's kind of up to like how a certain historical narrative is preserved, or how well it was being told in the first place, that kind of contains the truth or the validity of it. Versus, I think about certain communities or certain groups of people, particularly marginalized communities, who they might not have the kind of privilege to be able to preserve their historical narrative in such a bulletproof way that it maintains its truth and its validity over time. I don't really know if this is translating, but this is how I see the generational loss, right? Because like it's precisely that. It's lost through generation, and as stories are told and as they're passed down through people, kind of like in the game of telephone, it's like it totally changes, and its essence can be lost over time. So I think a major question in terms of like fragmented or fractured communication is like, how do you preserve the integrity of what it is you're trying to tell? And especially in terms of like history or culture, stuff like that, where there's like very integral parts, but it kind of boils down to like to privilege, and also accessibility, and also like who is involved in the telling and the retelling of how that can be held onto and how it can be preserved throughout time.
Yeah, I see your point, and I like the example. like taking your example of the VHS and trying to give you my more, let's say, theoretical personal perspective on this. If I were to rephrase my understanding of these fractures, I would take the VHS and think of it as precisely as, let's say, as the type of relations that we have under particular historical circumstances. So I think the point you make is valid in terms of certain communities that, due to their position, are unable to determine, let's say that they're unable to determine the quality of the VHS, let's say, or of that reproduction in many ways. But I'd say that the VHS itself is the historical circumstances, and me being more of a Marxist, I'd say, are precisely those conditions of reproduction or of production. And this would be more of my position, or following that thread is, so you have, I'd say you have, there's the problem of the people who are misrepresented, but that misrepresentation is tied to the narrative, again, like you propose, and this is where I think the issue of contingency becomes problematic. And this is not something I came up with, but it's the point of if let's say, if we leave the VHS aside and we just see the image becoming more and more distorted without ever considering the VHS, there's a point where we assume the distorted image to be either essential or natural, and that becomes the image that we have of everyone, and the image from which we tell our history, or tell history in general, which is already that distorted image. But it's my point being that the only way we could, if we were to return to the problem of fragmentation, I'd say the only way that we could consider the fragmentation is considering that fragmentation results from a particular, and let's say, being a distortion in a way of the abstraction of the interactions, right? Because the image is so distorted that we forget why it is that it became so distorted, and eventually assume that, let's say, certain exclusions that are grounded on direct racism, or gross racism, in many ways become justified as that racism becomes either essentialized or naturalized. And we forget that there are historical circumstances that not only led to those conditions of repression, but at the same time, help us understand that historical that oppression is historical, and thus could be overcome. So I think that the example of the VHS plays fundamental role. And I think, returning to your initial point, I think the VHS is also let's say, a burden on self-representation, because our image of ourselves continues to be distorted as the last image, but we again don't have the reference of the VHS.
I think, yeah, the point you make about the medium that it's taking, I think that's very important, because, I mean, this is just one example, of course, but I think about the way that certain people, that certain groups choose to preserve their own narratives or their own history. Now, I think with us being online, it is a lot more possible, it's a lot more accessible, but at the same time, it's a lot more complicated. Like, when you think about just like basic history, it's like writing books, preserving stories through books, and history books is very important, but that's like a very volatile medium, right? And it's very susceptible to change or being lost, or you aren't in control of who's writing it, who's preserving it, whatever. Versus now, people are able to find their groups online, and they're able to create, like, think about stuff like Facebook groups or like Discords, even like subreddits, all of these different platforms where people can congregate and talk amongst themselves and like preserve their own histories and like develop their own art or culture or whatever. This seems more permanent because it's online rather than like on paper or something. But at the same time, I think it's like still very susceptible to like the forces of the online world. It's like, who controls Reddit. If they if they delete your subreddit or whatever, I know this has happened a few times, it's like you lose all of that. Rather than if you're like self-archiving, you're still responsible, and it's still a pretty like volatile situation. So I think the medium that the communication or the historical narrative is like preserved on is very important. And I still don't think that we've reached, or at least I can't think of an example of something that's like a perfect medium to be able to preserve these narratives for certain groups, or even just like communications. Like, how many times has your phone broken and you've lost all of your text messages with all of the people that you care about, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But you just made me think of, because let's say initially the archive, or the official archive, which is a state institution, right? It serves a purpose of historical retelling, but it also serves a purpose, a colonial purpose. You know, it serves a particular reproduction of a logic of the state, right? It tells, like you were saying initially, a particular history. But at least, at least you say, when we think of the archive, is this physical institution which has these people who are appointed to the archive, and there's this let's say a clear confrontation with a particular, or we know the type of history that is trying to be told in an official archive, right? And I was thinking of platforms as this new archive as you were proposing. And I think it's not only, I think there's not only the risk that, yes, we don't have any control over the media and the place where the information is being stored, be it in Iceland, in some server that we don't even know where it is,
in the cloud.
In the cloud. But furthermore, it's one complicated thing is that, let's say either in Twitter or Instagram, we have no real knowledge of the algorithm that determines how our media is shared with others. But there is direct sharing, but there are instances where we don't know exactly how many people will be reached with a particular expression. I don't know. So there's that. So there's, and I return to the VHS. There's this, our history as stored in the cloud is mediated by the algorithm that we have not only no control, but we have no knowledge of exactly how it is that it operates. So our history would always be restricted by the algorithm and presented to someone as, let's say, if you don't follow me on Instagram, and some pictures that I take show up on your feed every once in a while, you could assume a life history, like you could assume my life history from those pictures, but that'll appear in a certain order and with certain, I don't know. So I guess that the medium becomes a means of distorting, but also naturalizing my history and leaving aside certain, we have no control over what is left out, I guess.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I guess, what we were talking about in the beginning of the translation that takes place from the self-presentation into what the other people are picking up from the story or from the like online archive. But what was your point about the algorithm? Because I think that's very interesting. I'm very interested in the algorithm. I've heard this because, and I'll do it really quick, because when there was this whole debate over canceling, over erasing Trump's tweet after the attempted coup or the coup. Oh right, yeah.
There was this whole debate over free speech on Twitter, and one of the arguments that I found very compelling was the fact that that free speech is still determined by the conditions imposed by Twitter, not only in terms of what it is that they consider to be offensive or no, but also, your tweets don't necessarily appear in a chronological sense, right? There's an algorithm that determines your feed. So you may have control over what you say, but you don't necessarily have control over how it is presented to others. Right. So there's that black box, which is the algorithm, which is between which determines our communication, and in many ways the fragmented logic of the communication, I guess.
Mm-hmm, yeah, for sure. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Matthew. I'm also a philosophy student, and my research is generally focused on I guess you could call it like post-phenomenological inquiry. So people like Derrida, Heidegger, Jean-Luc. So I'm glad that history has become already a central kind of component of what we're talking about. I don't want to take us too far away from the algorithms, because I think that's an important element. And maybe what I'll do is I'll start by just kind of posing a question based on what I've kind of heard up till now. And in the relationship between preservation and archiving and history, and also I think, Carlos, from your perspective, like correct me if I'm wrong, a kind of emancipatory ideal within the relationships or historical relations. Because one of the things that I think is interesting, Anna, that you brought up is the way that there's a certain sense of noise being produced in the process of communication, like in the photo that you showed, in the repetition of a kind of archival material or something like that. A certain noise, a certain distance is reproduced, and also potentially exposed to erasure. And I guess the question, if we're thinking about in terms of history, is how to think from that perspective of the possibility of voices being erased. And if we're going to use historical relations, Carlos, like you said, to determine or somehow deal with the possibility of determining a context in which emancipatory action can unfold, how to think the relationship to the voices that don't even actually appear within any kind of historical archivization. Like, I think I'm thinking here specifically of Foucault and Benjamin. And Foucault has this great line where he says, the entry into the archive indicates an encounter with power that allows for the voice to be preserved. And there's a kind of whole horizon of silence that is produced on the fringes of the archive of voices that don't necessarily call out across historical archives for responsibility. So I just wanted to pose that as a question. I don't know if it's a question.
Well, I think it was kind of a question. I get your point. The notion of power, yeah, that isn't something that I was exactly saying in my explanation, but I think it's what I was like subconsciously trying to get at. So I like you brought it up, because it is up to like he who holds the most power, who's getting to decide what gets erased and what gets preserved. And I think that this is a major point in terms of people being able to self-preserve their own narratives or their own personal histories or histories of groups. It's like taking the power back, but then also you have to question like exactly how much are they doing that, and how much power do they actually hold? Because we were just talking about like the transmission of, or I guess like the transplacement of like into a different medium or into a different format, where it's like it still isn't working really the way that it would that is ideal, but it's still an improvement in the way that like people are able to communicate in a better way. And there is this ability to archive rather than it used to be a lot more in the hands of whoever was the most powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to reflect on just kind of the industrialization of communication that has occurred, right?
Yeah.
Like our social field is being constituted by mediations that are, in a certain sense, dominated by, like, you could view it as dictatorial corporations. You know what I mean? So you have like things like Facebook, things like Twitter, basically governing conditions for a kind of quasi-public discourse.
Well, the best example is Tumblr, like the big, I forget what the name for it. There's like this like Armageddon of Tumblr where they banned all adult content, and like a bunch of primarily queer artists, they got a lot of their work like completely erased from the platform. So that's a really great example of this erasure that can take place and is very susceptible to the powers that be.
Yeah, and even on a positive note, like, or potentially positive note, I mean, I think in a very complex way, like, you know, the banning of Donald Trump from Twitter, from Facebook,
Yeah.
like like he's basically disappeared from the airspace in a certain sense because
I know he like doesn't exist now. It's crazy.
and it's actually it's there's a kind of danger to that as well, right? Because he's kind of manipulating the Republican Party from the background, but like it just shows the way in which our kind of what we view as potentially public discourse has been industrialized and is now used in a kind of extractive logic that encourages like what Baudrillard might call like an ecstasy of communication or like an orgy of communication that necessarily maybe like lots of signal is kind of like getting lost in that process as well, and is open to, you know, a different kind of historical remolding than before. And I think one of the interesting things that you pointed out is like there is a possibility of like personal like archiving in a much more radical way, but and maybe I can mediate this in the direction of Carlos, is that like that personal archiving seems to like be in a certain sense atomizing as well, which I see kind of in your reading of Jameson as being kind of a problem.
Yeah, I think I think for me there's a couple of issues, or because I let's say I'm least optimist on the role that these platforms might play in communication, precisely because I think there is a regulatory logic behind what they do, and I don't think it's this conspiracy theory over, you know, Twitter trying to control our minds or anything of that sort. But I think there is a particular logic that governs Twitter, even if Twitter itself is not conscious of that logic, you know. And let's say, yeah, conversations determined by likes or by shares or by these sort of motivations that are very much in a way market motivated or under market logic, where you try to position yourself always as this, I don't know, yeah, you're a type of commodity that is better shared or more, or has a bigger price in those spaces, right? Because more people want to buy or follow your expression. There's a huge truck. So I guess there's that logic that seems to be that seems to underline all expressions or all interactions, and even the archival process, even if it's a personal one, even if I just have Instagram to share pictures with my friends and family, in many ways that archival process is still governed by the logics of Instagram or Twitter. So I think there you have that, but at the same time, I think that can't be separated from the manner in which we understand our historical moment. And what I mean by that is, in many ways, we assume those market logics or those market impulses to be natural, right? So like how we assume competition to be natural in many cases, we assume that personal, that selling yourself online, you know, like you're promoting your brand, it becomes this very natural thing, this thing that is to be normal of and human, and it seems to be like this essential motivation, but there seems to be no historical critique of that, right? And there seems to be no historical critique of that type of relation with others, because ultimately, even if it's happening online, it's still a form of interaction. And I think that in itself, on the one hand, it becomes limiting of the type of interactions we can have, but at the same time, it further establishes that natural logic in which I see you and you see me as interacting in a sort of social market, and I'm trying to one up you on my social capital, I guess, right? So we assume these things to be very natural, but there's a historical logic, and this is my philosophical position. This is something that results from the particular relations that result or that exist in a capitalist mode of production, right? Where everything is abstracted, and even our history or our archival process is itself an abstraction, right? We think we are presenting an image of ourselves, and we assume that the conditions under which, or the logics that determine that presentation, are essential. But there is a historical logic, and which is particular to capitalism underlying, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to dive deeper into the historical piece here, and I want to go back. I want to just ask you, Carlos, about your view on absolute contingency, and because I don't know if people in the audience had a chance to look at the abstracts, but I looked at, when I read yours, one of the things that struck me was the way that from a perspective, like a Marxist perspective and from a Jameson perspective, that capitalism is somehow leading to a dissolution of the very movement of history or something like that. Like there's a sense in which the inability to connect across some kind of identification that would exceed like kind of the particular function of the self within the market creates like the impossibility of creating historical consciousness or something like that. And I wanted to, I guess, like, because I feel like from my perspective, from the perspective of, you know, kind of post-Derridian thinking of history, in a sense, history itself as a concept does continues or is demonstrating itself to have maybe less of a future than we thought. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of apocalyptic event. It just means that in a certain sense, the way in which we conceived of history as a directional oriented narrative towards progress is being overrun by perhaps, and this is maybe where the technical stuff comes back in, by a field of mediation that exceeds the possibility of a singular or a trajectory governing it, right? So the field of mediation, probably due to globalization and increased speed of communication, it makes it difficult an advancement narrative to actually function.
Yeah, I know. And this is something. I'll start from the last part, and I guess there's always that risk or that thread of the logic of and like you were saying, like that critique that Benjamin proposes of this historical reading of history as this lineal process of continuous progress. But I guess in many cases that has been, from Benjamin till now, that position has been mostly, I'd say mostly abandoned, either on the position, let's say, going to, this is the cliche, but it's, you know, the Francis Fukuyama diagnosis that history is over, or that ideology is over. And again, and also something that is very, and here I'll kind of, this is an internal discussion within sociology or anthropology, which is the point of contingency, right? So for many sociologists and anthropologists, the contingency becomes a central element as historical narratives are rejected, right? Because we can't explain social phenomena, or let's say certain sociologists or anthropologists look to reject a narrative, to study social phenomena from the logic of a larger historical narrative, right? Of historical determinism. So you assume that the only way you can represent a particular phenomena is through the contingent elements that participate in that phenomenon. But then a Marxist critique, or the Jamesonian critique, let's say, is that this absolute contingency becomes the absolute transformation of everything, right? So there's a constant transformation of everything, and so and his point is that constant transformation becomes a stasis, in the sense that everything is static. If everything changes all the time, everything is static, because then change becomes the order of things. And if everything is changing, there's no point there. It's hard to determine where we stand. That's more or less his point. So the Marxist critique, or the Jamesonian critique, is to historicize. Like I said before, it's, if we try to understand all our interactions in historical terms, understanding the conditions are not contingent, or not essential, or not natural, but historical, determined by historical circumstances, then that's the, let's say, emancipative effort of historicizing, I guess. And I'll be very brief, just because I just remember that you talked about those voices that are being excluded, and I think that, or my thesis would be, and without looking to undermine any experience of oppression, I think that it is the communal historical experience, not in the sense that we have all suffered the same sort of oppression, but that the logics that determine oppression are within a shared history, right, or a shared historical relations, that I think that fragmentation can be overcome in many ways, or that we can establish points of solidarity, if you will.
Thanks for sharing, Carlos. I really appreciate your interrogation of especially a Marxist perspective. I think I'll introduce myself really quickly. My name's Hannah, and I'm a master's student in the communications department. So I'm specifically working with media studies. When I think about erased voices and archiving your life and how you want to be perceived online, I think about specifically the excluded voices of folks, you know, the most marginalized, those that don't have access to the internet. I'm personally of the opinion that the internet should be a human right. I don't think that there should be that sort of exclusion. But when I see that, I think about folks in prison and how they absolutely cannot voice what their life is, what they wish for it to be. Here I would quote Angela Davis when I think about her saying that prisons relieve, what did she say? Sorry, I have the quote right here. She said, prisons relieve us from the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially with those produced by racism and increasingly global capitalism. So I would think that even though we ourselves struggle with how we interpret our personalities and our accomplishments and our lives online, that is so sorely different than what folks who've been shunned and cast away from our society are able to do with these conversations. They can't be here right now. We're able to, you know, host these very, very professional and academic discussions over Zoom because we have that privilege, right? Even within this horrible circumstance that is the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that we forget sometimes that how much privilege we have as academics and as thinkers, right? That, you know, so many opportunities are taken away from those, especially who are racialized or sort of forced into these judicial systems that they can't partake in these conversations. I think that that's worthwhile mentioning too.
Yeah, I think just the capacity or the privilege to be on the internet. Obviously, it's opening up this whole world, but then beyond this, it's opening up this huge connection to history and like histories that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to connect with, or you wouldn't have, you know, you're kind of like susceptible, or you're at the mercy of what you hear and the types of people that you're surrounded with, versus now you can kind of pick and choose. You can choose to learn more about something. You can, you know, like get lost in these internet holes, and it results in this it can result in like knowledge that will totally revolutionize your life, right? And also I think that something that the internet gives to us through this ease of communication is, you know, we're just able to connect everything back to like histories that we can learn and observe. Like everything's just more, I mean, everyone always says like it's at our fingertips, like whatever, I have a dictionary or everything at my fingertips. But something that I was thinking about when Carlos was just talking, when you're talking about like the contingency of history and all of this, is like how now with the internet, I think we're a lot more prone to observe like the hauntology of contemporary occurrences. So I was wondering if, I feel like Matt has more to say about hauntology, and I don't know if you guys do as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to echo the comment about the excluded from the internet and some of the other voices that are worth talking about in these contexts. One thing that always I think comes up, and actually I think ties back to maybe the question of history, and also, you know, one of the things that I think plays a huge role in the like fracturing of communication right now is just the fact that we're dealing with networks of mediation at global scales and rapid speed. And that's partially what people are being excluded from in a certain sense is this access to like a hypersynchronic network of information exchange. And I think partially some of the tensions that are emerging, perhaps even in history, is that collective identification at the level of a state or a common will or something like that is being problematized because information is flowing in such a way between like across the borders, or making it difficult to clearly delimit the borders of flows in economics. And I think that's what I wanted to bring up, was just the problems of migration and the problems of exclusion that are based on the logics of identification as a major place for rethinking our kind of societal obligations to the outside and to what is beyond our borders. Because I think we're dealing with no longer historical logics that are governed by human action or will, but by absolutely inhuman processes such as like technological advancement and also climate change, which are going to have massive human implications. The very borderlines of who's included and who's excluded in the movements of those kinds of people as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think when we think about climate change and we think about how these issues that affect everybody are politicized, right? That to deny something that is so evident, even with the pandemic, that happened as a direct result of globalization, climate change, and capitalism, right? These issues that are man-made, and how we've sort of created these spaces to discuss these issues that like politicians and billionaires and those who hold this sort of economic monopoly on how to solve these issues these spaces are made increasingly less accessible, either due to monetary limitations or even semantics, right? How we discuss these issues directly impacts folks who don't have access to higher education, who don't have access to food, who don't have access to clean water or housing or the internet. And, you know, even us as academics, I think we have a responsibility to make these, that's why I think that open forums like this are really, really important. But even so, it's tricky, because when you think about an academic conference or an academic roundtable, that's not going to appeal to a lot of people, right? It's going to appeal to people like us who are academically inclined or philosophically inclined. And I think it's our job, if, you know, those who are of the authority to dictate how much a higher education is going to cost somebody, I think it's our job as academics to put on more events like this that are, especially in terms of semantics, accessible. Because we understand Foucault, we understand these really, really historically ingrained scholars, but I think it's also important to include the voices of folks who don't necessarily need that theory, that have the lived experience to sort of say, hey, my voice is being ignored, or I live in poverty every single day, or I don't have access to these resources, I can't afford this. I think to a certain degree, that's a lot more important than sort of regurgitating the harsh word, but sort of regurgitating these thoughts. So I think that that's a really important thing to consider too.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with the issue of excluded voices. I think it's, but I guess what continues to be partially problematic, I guess, is that I think that it's something that plays at two levels. There are effectively groups that are excluded, and we should understand the grounds of that exclusion, because the grounds of that exclusion also determine the inability that we have to connect amongst each other and to understand the logics of that exclusion. But at the same time, I think there has to be more reflection on the medium that through which we want to incorporate or allow other voices to participate. And here I think it's obvious that academia is a space very limited, and it's not only very limited in its inclusion, but it's in many cases we can admit that it's very limited in its impact, in the impact that it has on the world. Because we could speak of Foucault and Marx all day here, but ultimately the decisions taken in Ottawa or Washington will not take either Foucault or Marx into consideration. So, right, we tell ourselves a lie of importance, which helps us feel more important, but it's not necessarily impactful. But at the same time, there's a real problem of, and I guess this is what I was speaking to Anne at the beginning. It's that we see ourselves in these distorted images, right? Like the final image through the VHS, but we can either we assume the VHS to be this horizontal blank space of absolute communication, right? The internet seen as this very very utopian manner, and at the same time and in doing so we don't see how the internet itself is a space of exclusion, or it can operate under logics of exclusion. So I think it's valid to call for inclusion, but at the same time we need to question how we want that inclusion to take place. And I think that's where we continue to be fragmented, because I think we can all agree on including those people who are being excluded, but I guess the place where we might find ourselves to be distant is what that inclusion implies and how that inclusion should take place.
Hi, that's great, Carlos. Thanks. I'm going to follow on from that point in a second, because the conversation's been super interesting so far. But just first of all, people notice there's one more timer coming up. That's for the rest of the audience to join in if they so wish. You'll, at that point, when that timer reaches 0, everyone in the audience is going to be upgraded to a panelist. So feel free to, so the conversation will probably get a bit more chaotic at that point. But just coming to that point you were just saying, both Carlos and Hannah, and also going back earlier to where the conversation started, one thing that's been really kind of jumping out at me is kind of this question, maybe not in these terms, but questions of continuity and discontinuity. First of all, how do communities maintain each other over continuous time, whether you need discontinuities, whether you want to kind of reach out or create kind of, I suppose, enabling boundary conditions as communities have to have. But one thing that really, especially Anna, you were talking with your the image you had and the question of how stories change over time, I believe, was going back to that. One thing that really kind of struck me was, yeah, in terms of like, if you look at outsider, because we're talking of a lot of the conversation has been around effects of the mode of production we're in now, which we call capitalism and whatnot, and it's spread across the world. But yeah, one thing that came to mind was how there was this group of people in Ireland, I'm Irish, by the way, the accent didn't give it away, who they lived essentially very much, they were on this island called the Blasket Islands. It was a very rough existence, very much not a kind of, very much almost pre-modern in a lot of senses. And it was, they really just kind of, people were moved off the island in the 50s, but they had this very rich oral tradition, kind of how they would pass it down. And sometimes it was compared in some places to kind of, the kind of almost the Homeric kind of totally oral, very few of the people were literate. But one of the ways in which they managed to preserve their stories and maintain continuity was actually by introducing a discontinuity into the actual stories themselves. So what they would do is the broad structure of the story would remain the same, but they would weave their own autobiographies into the story itself, so that they were in the stories too. And it was all completely in Irish as well, so that was, it wasn't even in English. Yeah, so they introduced this kind of like they maintained the continuity while also precisely by introducing a discontinuity into it. That is, a historical anachronism of they themselves were the participants in the story. And I just wonder, this kind of, well, I mean, this is more kind of just a provocation rather than a question, because I don't have a question. Yeah, is it how do you define those kind of boundary conditions, those enabling boundary conditions in one sense, in order to keep things and preserve things and keep things going? And also everyone's joining us now, by the way, but I'll throw that back to the group first of all before.
I'll jump in, I guess. I don't know. I don't know. I think, and I'll return to Matthew's question. I think that contingency becomes a means of continuing, in the sense that contingency becomes a means of abstracting and naturalizing certain attitudes and certain relations, right? So, and I guess and returning to the point of exclusion, I think in that sense, contingency also becomes a means of perpetuating exclusion, in the sense that, yes, it's like if we were to, let's say, interact every day and not consider the conditions under which we interact, and forget how it is that we came into that interaction, and someone always seems to be excluded from our interactions, there's a point where we assume that there must be either an essential or a natural cause that leads to that exclusion, right? And we leave aside any of the material or historical elements that brought us to the interaction in the first place. So I guess, following your idea, I think that's probably, and that's probably the complexity of capitalism. It's so flexible and fluid, and it operates under this logic of abstraction that it's hard for us to establish any other continuity that is not that of contingency and abstraction. We lose, and here I'm just not saying anything new. This is Jameson, but we find it difficult to locate ourselves historically, and thus we have no, even though we think we project a historical self, let's say, on those, in that archival self-archival process that we participate in, we are in many ways lost, and assuming attitudes that are abstract, we assume to be abstract, or to be assumed to be natural, but are historical.
So it's a regulated continuity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Matthew.
No, I was just gonna say, if I could jump in, I definitely agree with what Carlos is saying. And I also think I have potentially a slightly different way of reading the story that you told, because I think it's really fascinating. And I think the thing that jumps out to me is the way that there's a kind of repetition and singularity intertwining in that passage of history, right? So you have, on the one hand, the repetitive historical function of the story in the past, linking up with a singular performance of it by a specific trajectory through space-time that is related to other specific singular trajectories through space-time. And I think one of the things that we can think about in terms of the absolute increase of archival technology is perhaps a certain disjunction between the synchronizing function of the story that's being told, you know what I mean, the kind of the continuity piece, and actually a reduction of the diachronic or the singular piece of life kind of passing through space-time. And I think so that gives a different spin to the idea that history is, in some sense, reaching a kind of stasis, is that it's actually not the change that is occurring, but it's actually the movement towards, and the immense expansion of archivization is making it impossible to allow true difference or singularity to emerge, right? And so there's a kind of disjunction between the relationship between the singular and the relationship between the repetitive that's kind of occurring. So it's just that would be like a Derridian, Knottsian reading of the history closing kind of piece, which also leads to, I think, just one of the, on the horizon of the question I was asking Carlos, is the idea of the impossible community, which doesn't view the communalization process in terms of identity, but in terms of a relationship between singularities, and thus always kind of contested and always open to potential ruptures, and thus unallowing a kind of pure emancipation or liberation in history. So anyway, that's a long piece, but I think that story there's a lot of still in there.
No problem. I'll let anyone else, if anyone else wants to come in, actually, because that was...
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that because I had a question that came up actually from the very first sort of discussion that Anna and Carlos had, and actually refers to something you just said, Matthew, as well. the idea of our presentation, that we are in a virtual space, and we don't know how to come across to people on the screen. We're trying to get a sense of them and convey a sense of us. And actually, what you just said, Matthew, kind of the idea of the sort of the relationship between individuals, and as Nancy also talks about, the sort of a being towards, and that being related to sense between individuals and sort of a community. And it's interesting when we talk about, conveying our sense through likes on different platforms. And is that, or can that ever be a ground, in the same sense as like the example that Fintan just brought up, ever be a ground for sociality or community, in the sense that we have understood through history and archival sort of historicizing? That's something that I kind of would like to throw out as a question to the group. So can ever be a sense like that truly be conveyed, or even, archived and understood as part of a...
If I can just have one more short reflection kind of on that, is it reminds me of some kind of Derridian thoughts on love, right? And he breaks down the distinction between the who and the what as being the question of the kind of instability that love is kind of always related to. Do I love this singular person in front of me, or do I love what they represent, the categories that they bring? Do I love their red hair or what have you, right? And I actually think that the social relation, the relation of difference that isn't a categorical difference, not a difference between what's, but a relation between who's, is what we're actually talking about. And what's being reproduced in terms of what Carlos is talking about is a logic of categorical difference or categorical identification, in which terms are opposed to each other and mutually restricting and defined. And so the love is in a different direction, perhaps, if that's going to be the ground of some kind of sociality.
Yeah, I would have to agree. A categorical differentiation was, and like still is to a degree, such a large part of how I formulate my social circles, right? How we all do. It's who we have the most in common with, who we even look alike to in some regards, right? We have similar fashion sets, we have similar tastes in music, political ideology, and sort of being confined to our homes at this time, not having those social interactions, not being able to go out for a drink with our friends after a long day, I guess, redefine how we occupy those spaces, right? And even now, I think about how much identity politics informed a lot of who I spent my time with, how I grew as a person. And now that that's been stripped to a degree, I'm just this lady in my house with my computer, and sometimes I interact with like my friends who are also gay, or my friends who have this sort of idea about communism, and like there will be offshoots of those discussions, but it's very much just like, man, I wish I could give somebody a hug. I don't want to be confined to the Zoom square anymore. And it's so much less about identity, and it's more about just genuine human connection at that point, which is very interesting.
I'm looking for the clap button for sure.
So also, if any of our audience members have something they would like to contribute or discuss, please do feel free to jump into the discussion.
Hello. Hi. I just want to preface this by saying that I'm not an academic, and thanks for inviting me into this circle. I kind of stumbled across you on the internet trying to return a book to someone in Montreal. I was hearing the word exclusion coming up a lot, and I kind of wanted to bring up that maybe a flip side of exclusion could be like denouncement. I was living in New York before COVID hit, And I was seeing a lot of internet is a human right written around like public infrastructure, parks, and they're running Wi-Fi through the subway and all that. And I feel like generally when I see people, you know, using their phones in Bryant Park, I think a lot of what's happening is working and shopping. And when we say, sorry, I'm tripping over my words a little bit. I'm also thinking about, I'm a sex worker and I lost all my income, and I've been working for the last few months in like, or for the last year in tax clinics for sex workers, because you had to prove an income and a loss of income to qualify for CERB, which really could have been made universal, but wasn't. So I spent a year like really lining people up to be counted by the CRA when they've decided for various reasons not to. And when we say, you know, inclusivity that I'm making by working in a tax clinic, I'm making CERB accessible to sex workers. I'm in the process, I'm dragging them into a system that they may have like opted to not be a part of. And a lot of my friends are fryballs and are kind of outliers in various ways. And sometimes marginality, I think, can be like being shoved into silence in cases like prisons, that's really important to talk about. But in other cases, I think marginal positions can be taken on voluntarily, and that there are kind of lines of communications inside of margins that are illegible to this or that system. And I think that's really important to preserve, I guess. I might be in your boat, Carlos. I'm not feeling super optimistic about social media lately. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone has anything to say about like denouncement versus exclusion, or if that's even a reasonable way to put that.
Tara, I just want to say I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for
sharing. Thanks. This is super cool. I just stumbled across this morning and I was like, oh wow, that's now. I can
Welcome.
Cool.
Thank you.
I just like thank you for coming and thank you for sharing your experience working in a tax clinic for sex workers. Thank you for doing that.
I never filed my taxes before CERB. I had to back file like 7 years of taxes.
I mean, like talk about exclusionary systems, like the tax system and the CRA, right? And CERB, right?
Yeah.
It was such a gut punch that it wasn't universal, and that was a choice. That was an active choice by the government.
Right.
People like sex workers, like people who can't prove their income, like folks who weren't able to work. You know, what does that say? What is the government saying to them, right? Like, it's a big, like, pardon my French, but it's a big fuck you, right? And so it's so important, I think, that there is that. What was the word that you used? There's exclusion and what was the other?
I was thinking denouncement, or maybe just outlying and outlying the system by choice.
Yeah, like tax systems very much have outliers, purposeful outliers, I think, to a degree, that it's like you're not conforming to this sort of societal idea of what a career should be. You know, the fact that sex work isn't decriminalized speaks to that, I think. That
it just feels dicey saying that.
It's very dicey. And, you know, that you're made to be a criminal for pursuing a specific career path, either due to like a personal choice or economic disadvantages. Just economic outlying as well, and exclusion, I think, is an important factor there too. So I think that CERB is an excellent example of economic outliers during COVID, and an exclusion that seems very, very purposeful in the eyes of the government. So thank you for coming here and, you know, speaking to your experience. Thank you for working with other sex workers to make their lives safer, because that's definitely, you know, the CRA can be so predatory, I think.
Yeah.
That
aside from,
right.
Aside from my own experience, I just meant to sort of bring up like voluntary, what's the word? Like marginality, I guess, by choice, because I think we talk a lot about the other kind of marginality, which I don't know that of course that matters to say too. But it's just like if you're deciding not to use the internet, I think it's getting harder and harder to just like turn around corners, maybe especially in cities without that tool.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So it's like, does inclusivity mean pulling people into a system that they've possibly opted out of because they're going to experience violence if they don't?
Yeah, it seems certainly that there is like a societal pressure to be on social media, to
it's hard to find a fucking flat in New York if you don't have social media. You're going to apply to a room and there'll be 30 other people and they'll say, show me your image. And if you don't have that, you don't have housing. Like that's pretty basic housing.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I think I like the point that you made about, you know, folks on their phone, they're either, you know, browsing social media or they're shopping. That's very true.
Yeah, it's like the human right to shop constantly.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the point that I would, I guess, counter to that with regards to the internet being human rights, I think just access to information is so important. Like I know that the internet is obviously monitored by these large conglomerates that want you to shop, that want you to spend your money at like just the bare, like I need a new top suddenly because I saw this ad on Facebook, right? There's that, but then there's also, you know, somebody who's homeless that can't get in contact with somebody unless they have access to the internet, right? So I think it's like a double-edged sword there where it's like, yeah, there's certainly a lot of commercialization that happens on the internet, but there's also like a foundation of connection that somebody might not have otherwise if they didn't have it. So I think there's that, they're missing that choice too.
Yeah, I'm in Nova Scotia currently and our library's just shut down. And now it's like, holy shit, like those are the computers for a lot of people here. So.
Yeah.
I really do. By the way, welcome to the conversation just on the part of the organizers. No, it's really, it's great because it also like, we try to have uncertainty as our main idea. So even your occurrence in here is also part of, you know, very much part of the spirit of what we're trying to do.
That's a first.
But yeah, no, this kind of concept of, that like voluntary marginality or something like this. I mean, even it goes back to, just in the story I told before, I mean, those people were, they wanted to continue living on that island, but they were forced off by the government because the government precisely wanted them within the networks that they were establishing within the modernization of Ireland, which was in the 50s. But yeah, and they don't survive. They no longer survive as a community and don't, because they chose not to go into the system, to keep themselves outside. So I think it's super interesting how you brought it up, especially within the concepts of sex workers and whatnot, as a kind of a more contemporary version of that. I thought that was great. But yeah, no, I mean, that was, sorry, what my piece was to say, I guess, is it is just interesting, just generally, just coming, I mean, I suppose I'm just coming back to this kind of question about this kind of struggle between continuity and discontinuity, between how do you maintain yourself as an individual, but also, as Carlos was saying earlier, the question of you're kind of a regulated kind of element. You must be an individual, but in a certain way, I guess is the thing, and not in the way in which, I don't know if anyone wants to kind of come back on that point as well.
I just wanted to jump in briefly because Tara made me remember there's this, it's not like an academic term that has been established, but it's this notion of negative solidarity, which derives from Spinoza's idea of why people struggle for their own, what is it, their servitude instead of their liberation.
Why should I support this strike? Basically, I get paid less than them.
Yeah, and with CERB that became very relevant, where you'd have not only columnists for the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, but people in general saying, why should I be paying someone else for not working, right? And that inability to come to a basic notion of solidarity, right? So, but which I think is very much tied to precisely this, to the idea that we understand those conditions of competition, and there's this during COVID, we've all seen this idea of being, of staying strong and trying to endure the challenges. And we've kind of assumed these values to be very intrinsical to the human experience, being almost natural to humanity. And thus we assume that those who cannot join the system under the same conditions it's not only that they are to be excluded in a way, but that they're not keeping up to the basic logic of struggle and endurance that we find to be this very human logic, but that in many ways, or that we at least should question if it has a particular historical grounds, right? Why do we think that enduring or suffering is something to be valued, and not something to precisely reject, and something that in many cases can seem more as an irrational tendency, that's something that should be determining how we exclude or include certain populations, I guess.
Does that speak to your point you were making much earlier, Anna, when it was you were talking about kind of how there was especially this question of solidarity and stuff, and you were saying as in terms of like the archives that were maintained on the internet, and so to speak, and the kind of the way like people constitute themselves versus there was a Tumblr one you mentioned, and then there was also, I'm just thinking also subreddits. I mean, I'm a pretty prolific Redditor myself, so I can speak to that point. That's how I keep in touch with people back home, people I don't know, actually, interestingly enough. As this kind of this question of well, actually, I'll leave it there, and I'll let you respond as a.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question? I just got.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Yeah, no, I was just like, especially this question of solidarity and community and whatnot, and negative solidarity, especially kind of like, how do you maintain that, or what enforces that? But as in how it gets realized on online spaces and within online communities themselves is the kind of a thing. Maybe not the negative solidarity specifically, but yeah, this, how do you maintain these communities, and also just how they're subject to the, well, as you said earlier, kind of like a lot of these online communities as such are predicated on essentially the businesses that run them. Tumblr was the example as kind of a thing, and the creation of these communities as such. My own example was just Reddit as a kind of a thing. I don't know if that's clear or less clear.
No, yeah, for sure. Like, to me, it just makes me think of like the false sense of power that we have. I guess I was talking about this earlier, but the false sense of power that we have over our ability to like self-archive, and also the dependency that we do have on these platforms in order to be able to make them as public as they are, because even though we're the ones who are doing the work and we're telling our own stories, or certain groups are telling their own stories, they are essentially dependent on these certain platforms in order to reach the public, or even reach the people who they're intended for. So because of that, it does create this complicated structure of power. And although I think a lot of people try to take the power into their own hands, I think we see that fail more often than we see it succeed. Like after the Trump Twitter situation, what was it called? The platform that they tried to create, I think it was called Parler. It was supposed to be like a right-wing type of Twitter, and I don't think it really worked out that well. So yeah, I think that we're still very dependent on a lot of these power structures than I think that we would like, and I don't exactly know how we would break free of that. But that being said, I think I mentioned this earlier, like I do think it affords us these great opportunities of congregation, of online congregation, and being able to give ourselves platforms and give ourselves these spaces to talk and connect.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow it up and maybe link it also to back to Tara's question about marginality, because I think that direction is very much where my own political, like I guess, like where I find myself to be the most comfortable in the political ideological spectrum. And I think like one way to think about it, like Anna, you were talking about how in a certain sense there's a dependency on the hegemonic power structures and the systems, and we're forced in a certain way, like there is no absolute outside, maybe is one way to put this. So there is a sense in which we must negotiate with what is historically been determined. But Deleuze and Guattari have a concept which I think really captures what you're talking about in terms of marginality, which is the idea of a smooth space versus a striated space. And what that means is that there are certain spaces within the power structure that are more hierarchically organized, that have more of a kind of a logic of categorical difference or domination as part of them. And then there are places where people meet on the outside, you know, I mean, where you can find alliances in little pockets of that are maybe free of that hierarchical power. And I think that an example of the way that this like folds into itself, and there's kind of all, it's very hard to figure out, are these even two separate spaces, is right now, right? Like it's like we're kind of operating through a mediation platform that is owned by a global corporation, and yet like there are movements of difference occurring, right, and potentially opening pathways and all that kind of stuff, which breaks through kind of hegemonic power structures. And so you could view this like as a kind of meeting on the outside that doesn't make it's not an absolute movement towards being outside, but there's a kind of political efficacy or a disruption that occurs like when those kind of enclaves are created for alliances that are not based on identity to emerge. So alliances about the outside, perhaps, or about trying to find or create the outside so that people in their singularity can meet without being, shoved in this little boxes all the time.
I wonder if it forms a kind of identity when you do meet, or if you name yourself as an outsider collective, then it sort of pops out into another identity with margins in turn, probably. It's like if there's some way of expressing solidarity without convening or kind of defining yourselves as a subgroup, because even lots of people who do identify as marginalized in some way, it's like they still have I have lots of friends who are like, I'm not the kind of fag that makes a queer with a capital Q. And then it's like, bam, there it is again. If there's a way to be in a margin and to say that I know that you're in your margin without connecting directly, then there might, maybe I'm talking about telepathy. It's gotta be telepathy.
I guess it's.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanting to frame this kind of the idea of being inclusive without excluding at the same time, because it seems that that's also a lot what everybody's saying. You try to include them, even with the examples that you brought up, Tara, earlier about like trying to include even within the situation and a pandemic and a more marginalized group, but you're excluding them again through trying to be inclusive. And I guess what you just brought up was this sort of idea of not being either, just being accepting, maybe, I guess. I don't know if that's sort of but I don't know what the right term would it be, but yeah. Sorry, Hannah, go ahead.
Thanks. I think, bringing up especially the LGBTQ plus community is such an interesting example of that, because there are so many identities. So it's like communities within a community, right? Like myself, as a lesbian, there's so much discourse about being a lesbian that it's like frustrating, that you can't just be gay. You have to have this this very specific, there's like the gold star lesbian, or there's like the it's a lot, and so it becomes this exclusion within inclusion. I think that there's the LGBT community, I think, has a lot of issues with that I've seen personally, that I think would benefit from inter-community dialogue. But even then, it gets complicated, right?
Yeah, I wonder about jazz, maybe without convening or clarifying, you can still probably reach each other, and you might get maybe a way around identity in that way. But then it's like, yeah, it just gets to a critical mass, or it's like jazz.
Yeah,
Jazz.
that's sort of the problem, right? Where like you try to have these inter-community dialogues where it's just sort of like, hey, can't we all just like be, and then the discussion of intersectionality.
No, you can't just be.
You can never just be, right? There's always discourse to be had.
Yeah.
I guess probably touching upon your points and Matthew's point on that idea, on that possibility of reaching that, let's say, that marginal space beyond identities in a way. I think my problem with that would be that I think there are, even though forms of exclusion and oppression manifest themselves differently and can in no way be, let's say, comparable or exchangeable, let's say, right? There are particularities. I think there is a common ground for that oppression, right? There is a common determining, or there is a common cause for oppression, right? Even though there are, and here I'll say, I think the logics of oppression in our historical moment do operate under a capitalist logic, even though some of those oppressions, let's say, as patriarchy precede capitalism, right? The manner in which it expresses itself, or in which it is experienced, is determined by the type of relations we can establish under capitalism. So, that to say, I think that finding that space beyond is problematic, because I think the only way of really achieving the beyond is by overturning the cause of the base cause of the exclusion and oppression and exploitation. So I think that it's because it is that which determines those, or which causes those realities, I guess, right? So it's in a way it operates a little bit dialectically, in the sense that you don't have to necessarily abandon the identity, but understand that the identity and the manner in which the identity is experienced has a material grounds that might be shared, right? There is a historical experience that is shared.
What is dialectic? Sorry.
No, I mean, it's dialectic in the sense that
What does that
that
mean?
that it's a constant flow between your personal experience and the general experience, right? You are both constituted by the general interactions, but your interpretation reconstitutes those general interactions, right? So, I mean, and I say that because it's precisely that. You don't need to necessarily abandon your particular experience, and your particular experience does determine the manner in which you relate with the rest of the world. But at the same time, if we can understand that our experience is determined by general logic, which I would say is a historical logic. So just to say, I'm against, let's say, imagining a space beyond, and I guess I propose, or I would be in favor of a space of confrontation, right? Of confronting the basis of the oppression and the exclusion.
Yeah, and I
Sorry,
think
Matthew, we're going to have to close it down now. Sadly, is the thing.
This in Hegel, it's like.
Well, I think when there's Hegel's law. When the conversation reaches Hegel, we should close the conversation down. So yes, that was fantastic. I think that conversation was great. There was no way, again, as I said before, we could predict it, how we ended up kind of exploring all these various topics as such. I think I don't, Anna, you said we can just go ahead. Actually, I can just, great. So I'd like to send thank yous out again, once again, to Anna and Doug for facilitating this. They are, as always, excellent at keeping the show running behind the scenes, especially Doug with your timer. That was great.
That was great.
It really worked well. Thanks also for the Center for Expanded Poetics in the English department for the basic hosting of the project. I also like to express, as always, our thanks to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Concordia for their very generous support. So our next event is going to be on June 14th. The topic, Marlene, it's molecular.
I have it right in front of me. It's molecular selves in organic humanity.
Okay, yeah, so we're exploring very much the limits of the human in our next one. There's I just sent a link out for that, although click on it, you'll also get an email about it too, for sure. So if you want to join us for that, and of course, if both either as a audience member or a participant, do email us, let us know. We're always happy to have more people and expand the conversation out as much as possible. So from myself and Marlena,
Thank you so much.
thank you very much for joining us. I think it was great.
And thank you, Tara, for participating.
Yes, for your
Oh,
intervention.
thanks.
Really
Yeah, it was a surprise.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
very much.
We're gonna shut it down now. Thanks so much for being here, for your time.
Cheers.